Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to be talking about some tips to help you improve your sports photography, especially if you're just starting out. These will help you improve your game quite a bit. Right, the first tip is all about angles, and for the most part you want to be sitting down either on the grass or on a stool, and you want to be taking the pictures looking up. And why is that? Because it'll make the athletes look a lot more heroic. Especially if you're photographing kids, is very important because they're often looking down. So if you're standing up taking pictures looking down, you won't see their faces, you won't see their eyes, and that's also important, as you'll see in a few tips ahead. So first tip, get down low, get a stool, or just sit on the grass and take those pictures looking up. You'll see that your pictures will turn out much better. Second tip is all about the file format. JPEG versus RAW, the eternal discussion, which one is better? Well, RAW is better because it holds a lot more information and you can recover a lot more highlights and shadows from a RAW file than you can on a JPEG. Does that mean that it's the ideal file format? No, by all means, depends on the situation. If you're just starting out, I would actually recommend that you use JPEG, okay? RAW requires a lot more skill in editing. The files are also much bigger, so when you're taking big bursts, your buffer will reach its limit much faster. It doesn't make you fast, doesn't make you efficient. When you're editing, you need to know a lot more to be able to edit a RAW file than JPEG. And to be honest, for the most use that photographers give the pictures nowadays, JPEG will be sufficient. So my recommendation is, if you're starting out, JPEG. Remember in the first tip that we're talking about taking pictures looking up? Well, one of the reasons for that is also that we want to see the face of the athlete. And faces are very important. People connect a lot more when they see a face than when they see a back. One of the things that a pet peeve of mine is those pictures where you just see the backs of the players. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people like that. Athletes like that. Just look on social media, you'll see tons and tons of photos of people's backs. But if you're trying to connect with someone, people will want to see the face of the athlete. So make sure to include that. Speaking of faces, one thing that people like to see as well is the ball. So if it's a sport that involves a ball, say football, American football, rugby, etc., you get the idea. Include the ball in the picture. It's much better to see the ball in a picture than a picture without the ball. If it's just people running, it's not as appealing as if it's a person running with the ball, if it's a person shooting a ball. So if possible, make sure to include both the face of the athlete, obviously, but the ball as well. Now let's talk a little bit about equipment. First of all, don't get too hung up on having to have the best of the best cameras and lenses and whatnot. Just start shooting. That's the most important step, is to start it. Then if you're thinking about investing a little bit of money into this, you will have realized by now that sports photography can be very expensive. But you'll notice and you'll find that lenses outlast camera bodies by a long shot. So if you're investing, invest in lenses, okay? Some of my lenses are more than 10 years old. Camera bodies switch every 2 to 3 years. The technology moves a lot faster in cameras, whereas with a good lens will last you a lifetime. Next up is filling the frame. And by filling the frame, I mean getting rid of all that dead space that you don't need. And don't get me wrong, that space can be very important for the press, for example. But you don't need to have a 400mm or a 600mm to fill the frame. You can have the crop done in editing, okay? So make sure to get rid of the space, the things that are not important for the focus of your picture, which should be the athletes. If there's anything that is completely irrelevant, get rid of it. Fill the frame, crop in, it'll have a lot more impact. Next up is avoid chimping. And if you don't know this term, chimping is when you take a picture and you're constantly looking at the back to see how it looked like, or if you're using mirrorless, you don't even need to look like this. You can just see in the viewfinder. But that's exactly it. You're taking your attention away from the game. The game is not going to stop because you're looking at the pictures. And this may mean that you're missing out on the action. So avoid chimping as much as possible. Sure, sometimes you need to see how the picture is looking like. Sometimes you need to lock it, etc. But if you're constantly chimping, you're missing on potential great shots that are happening right in front of you that will not come back. So trust in your gut, trust that your settings are correct, and avoid chimping as much as possible. Next up is freezing the action. Sports photography, for the most part, will have high shutter speed, so I would say a good starting point would be 1,000 of a second. If you're talking about children, then maybe you can lower that shutter speed ever so slightly, but it gets to a point if you lower it too much, you'll start to see blur, and you don't want that. You want to have a crisp picture, and for that you need to raise that shutter speed. 1,000 of a second is a good starting point. Obviously, you will need to take into account the ambient light that you have, the lens that you have, meaning the aperture that your lens will allow you to open. All of that, understanding the exposure triangle is important. But if we're talking about freezing the action, a high shutter speed is very, very important. 1,000 of a second, good starting point. If you can raise it high and still keep that ISO low, brilliant, raise it even higher. As for focusing, AI servo to make sure that you're constantly focusing as you're tracking your subject. You don't want to have one shot where it just focus once and then the athlete continues to move. By the time you're taking the shot, it'll be blurred, out of focus. So AI servo to force the camera to constantly focus on your subject as you're tracking it and as you're taking pictures. Speaking of focus, there's a technique called back button focus. Now, if you're just starting out, this might not be the best idea to jump right into back button focus. What that does basically is you're removing the focusing function of the shutter button and you're assigning it to a different button, usually on the back of the camera. So the taking of the picture and the focusing are two different things when you're using this technique. But again, if you're starting out, maybe don't jump right into this technique. But if you want to learn more about it, I have made a video about this. I'm going to link it here. Just click on that link and I talk about more why it might be helpful in some situations to use this technique. Now let's talk about ISO. So in a perfect scenario, we would keep the ISO at 100, right? But we know that's not going to happen most of the time. If we're shooting at night in poorly lit situations, we're going to have to raise that ISO to compensate for the shutter speed and the aperture. But my recommendation is, if you're starting out, don't be afraid to use ISO on auto, okay? The metering on the cameras these days is quite good. If you set the shutter speed and the aperture of the camera and leave the ISO on auto, it's going to compensate to get you the perfect or a correct exposure. So in the exposure triangle, there's three variables, right? Shutter speed, we already talked about it. Then you have ISO, same, we just talked about it now. And the last one is the aperture. So ideally, you want to have your lens open as wide as possible for a few reasons. One, to let more light in. If you're letting more light in, you are able to keep that ISO lower, so less noise. And you're also making sure that the separation between your subject and the background is more evident, so the subject will pop. Okay? Now, one confusing thing for people starting out in photography is that a large aperture, so a big opening of the lens, is a small number, okay? So 2.8, it opens quite wide. Whereas if you have, say, 7.1, the opening will be much, much shorter. So you want to make sure to open it as wide as possible, because that will help you separate your subject from the background. So the plane of focus, which is the area that is in focus, say this is 2.8, this is the subject here, this is the plane of focus. What's here is starting to get out of focus more and more and more. Whereas if you have, say, 7.1, the area that is in focus is a lot more. So things inside of here will be in focus. So you want to use the lower number possible. Obviously be careful. Say if you're using a lens that opens at 1.2, then the margin of error is very, very tiny, because if you miss, it might be that your subject will be out of focus. Maybe you'll focus on the hand here and the face will be out of focus. So obviously take that into consideration, but generally speaking, the wider you open the lens, so the smaller the number, the better. Now let's talk about burst, which means basically getting as many FPSs, as many frames per second that your camera can produce. So you want that, you want the max possible. And why is that? Because if you can take, say, 12 frames per second versus 3, the chances of you getting that precise moment in a sequence of photos is much higher. So be sure to always use that in high speed continuous. And if you're talking about mirrorless, then you can go even crazier. For example, the camera that I use can go up to 40 frames per second, which I think is overkill, don't get me wrong. But if we're talking about using the mechanical shutter, which for the most part people watching this video might be doing, make sure to use it in high speed continuous to get as many frames as possible. Next tip is all about capturing emotion. And by emotion, it could be rage, happiness, frustration, anything that is a human emotion is what people connect to. You know, a team scoring a goal and celebrating, another team losing and crying because they lost the final, fans cheering, anything that has to do with emotions, be sure to capture it. That's a lot of the time the pictures that will sell the most is not the action during the game, but the reactions during the game, if that makes sense. Another tip is never stop shooting. And what I mean by that, let's say a goal has been scored, you take a photo of the shot of the goal of the first celebration, stay with the person that scored the goal. Sometimes they'll celebrate with their teammates, but then they'll turn around and they'll celebrate some more. So be sure to stay on him or her and take pictures, just spray, and you'll see that you'll capture a lot of shots that sometimes you think, oh, I didn't know he was going to do that. Stay on him. When the final whistle has been blown, don't stop shooting. You'll see reactions from both teams or the referee or the crowd in the stands. Never stop shooting. Another tip, which might seem quite obvious, is knowing the sport. And why is that important? Well, because you can predict the action. You know what's going to happen. You know where are the key moments of a particular game. If you're going to shoot a sport that you've never seen or heard before, so for my American friends watching this video, I shoot a lot of hurling, camogie, Gaelic games. Maybe you have never seen a game like this in your life. And if you were to photograph a game that you never saw before, how would you know what to capture? You wouldn't know. So if you're going to shoot a sport you've never photographed before or that you don't know too much of, study it beforehand, because it's going to help you a lot understand and predict the key moments of the game. Speaking about knowing the sport, that will also affect your positioning. For example, in football, you don't want to be standing on the side where the assistant referee is going back and forth for the offside, right? Because what might happen? He might be smack in front of you, blocking your photo. So you want to be on the opposite side. That's just one example. So keep in mind the positioning that you pick for your game will affect the shots that you take. Speaking of positioning, let's talk about the sun. And why the sun? Well, because it's quite a big source of light. And photographing against the sun is technically harder than it is if you have it on your back. So if you're starting out, having the sun to your back is much easier, okay? Now, if the sun is quite high in the sky, let's say it's midday or 1 p.m., it's not going to matter, right? But if the sun is about to set or is setting, have it on your back. Don't have it in front of you. Yes, you can get amazing shots if you know what you're doing with the sun facing you, but it's much harder if you're starting out. Speaking of what's in front of you, the background, so important. If you're shooting in an iconic stadium where it really doesn't matter where you sit, where you position yourself, the background is always going to be amazing, then you don't have to worry too much. If you have a fast lens, so one with a wide aperture that's going to blow the background away, it doesn't matter as much. But if you're starting out, the likelihood of you having a slow lens is high, and it's quite possible that you'll be shooting in amateur stadiums or venues, so be wary of your background. Just sitting on a different corner can mean that the background might not have, say, a house showing or a field or something that is distracting. The background is important because ideally we wouldn't want it to be there, We wouldn't want a background to distract from the main focal point, which should be the athletes. Okay, you want to be looking at a picture and almost ignore what's behind it and focus on the athletes. If you have houses or something distracting on the background, that doesn't go in your favor. So look around different positions and think, okay, if I sit here, what's the background going to be like versus if I sit there? So very important, looking at your background. Now we talked about the sun, we talked about positioning, we talked about the background. Let's talk about moving within the game. So trying to chase the action is completely pointless, okay? Don't get frustrated about the shots that you cannot take. You cannot be everywhere. We're just one person. We cannot be in every single corner of a field. Don't worry about the shots that you missed because you're not there. Worry about the ones that are coming near you. If you start moving every time you're trying to chase the action, you will find that most of the times then the action will go back to where you were. It's just the way it is. Obviously there are cases, for example, when the game is so uneven, it's like a one-way game all of the time. There's just one team attacking over and over. The other one is so poor. Then yeah, maybe you want to change sides so that you capture the team that is attacking the most. But for the most part, if the game is somewhat even, don't try to chase the action. Pick your spot and stay there, and you'll see the action will come to you as well. Now let's talk a little bit about editing, and one of my pet peeves is seeing this over and over again on the internet, Instagram, whatever, is people who do not straighten the horizon. Don't get me wrong, photography is a subjective art form, sure, to each their own, but I think this is very, very standard if you want to have your pictures in the press, that you have something that looks normal. And normal means a level horizon. It takes like 2 seconds to level the horizon in Photoshop or Lightroom. So take those 2 seconds to make your picture look that much better. It takes no time and it's so easy to fix. It's something that is seen so often. And people, if they think and get into the routine of, when I'm editing a photo, the first thing I'm going to do is level the horizon. It's just going to make your pictures look better. It's as simple as that. Continuing to talk about editing, the editing of the color, so the saturation, don't overdo it. Again, photography is a subjective art form. Yes, if you're into that, if you're into heavily saturated photos, like unrealistic photos, go for it. In my opinion, when I take photos and I edit them, I want them to look as real as possible. When I look at the photos, like, yes, this is what I saw on my screen. That's what it looked like. It didn't look like a movie, right? It didn't look like Blade Runner or something just weird. Don't get me wrong, again, if you're into that, go for it. You know, crank that clarity and texture and saturation, clarity, whatever it is you want to do, go for it. But in my opinion, something that looks real is a lot more pleasant to look at. Speaking of pictures that are pleasant to look at, publish only your best, okay? One common mistake of people who are starting out in sports photography is they want to publish absolutely everything. Take a look at these 500 photos I took during this game. Nobody wants to see 500 photos, okay? Pick your best, because if you're looking at a profile and there's few pictures but the quality is really high, that is so much more interesting than you're scrolling through a profile where the pictures are all the same. There's 10 pictures of the same angle of the same player. It's just pointless. So you need to be your own QA department. Pick your best, always. It's better to have fewer but good pictures than too many that, you know, you just lose interest. Another one that might seem very, very obvious is practice. You need to practice. If you're starting out, if you want to get better, practice, practice, practice. Get into as many matches as you possibly can. There's never too many, okay? And it really doesn't matter if it's an amateur game or a professional game. Sure, all of us would like to photograph Champions League every single day, but that's not the case, right? Sometimes we're photographing 4th division games or 3rd division or amateur games, but the practice doesn't take into consideration if the athletes are professional or amateur. It's you getting better. It's you perfecting your technique. It's you growing as a photographer. And that comes from practice. They say practice makes perfection. I don't think there's such thing as perfection, but it's going to help you get there. Then studying photography might seem obvious as well, but if you know what you're doing, photography is all about light and how you mold that light. If you have an artistic vision, but you don't know how to make your camera and your lens achieve that, maybe it's because you don't understand how everything in your camera and in photography works. And the more knowledge you have, the better you'll be able to mold the light that you're given to tell the story the way you want to tell your story. Then after learning all the rules, what are you going to do? Well, break them, because the rules are meant to be broken in photography. Yes, obviously it's important to, when you're photographing a game, to get some shots, some standard shots, but then try to think outside of the box, try to experiment so that you can try different things and that you can stand out from the rest. We're almost at the end. I have 2 more tips for you. One of them is study other photographers. Sometimes you'll find yourself photographing games with other photographers quite frequently. Look at their work, not to copy, but to get inspired, because you'll find often that you'll see other photographers will tell the same story that you were in, so to speak. So different photographers at the same game will tell the story different ways. Why? Because they take different pictures, different settings, different positioning, different framing, different equipment, obviously. But try to study other photographers so that you can grow yourself as a photographer as well. And the last tip is have fun. You know, whether you're doing this as a hobby or as a profession, if you're not having fun, you're gonna burn out. You're gonna stop caring, you're gonna stop growing. So it's very, very important that you're having fun when you're shooting. And that's it for today, guys. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. Until next time, take it easy, guys. Stay safe.